are competing in, we are repeating in, we are believing in. It's time for us to shift our mind from best in the world to best for the world. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional. It creates a new world to mind a shift, intentionality, perceptuality, conceptuality. We are choosing to shift our mind to best for the world, best for our world. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional.
Welcome to FiDE, the foundation for intentional decisions. Sorry, we had a little bit technical issues here, which is why I think in this moment it's a good reminder to remind ourselves what FiDE actually means in Latin, and it means to trust. And to trust that we will make good decisions, beneficial decisions for us. And this is why we have now solved these technical issues, and I can welcome Stellan Nordahl in the studio. My name is Jens Rinnelt. Welcome to FiDE.
Thank you very much, Jens. Yes, and I mean, everything that happens from outside is something you probably will experience in a day-to-day life, but you also experience your so-called inner life. Maybe that is how we experience things, and that is actually the foundation for this talk we're going to have. At some point in history, we divided up reality into an outer world and an inner world, and was that a good decision to do? That's a good question, of course. At the point when this was made, it was 300 years ago approximately, by René Descartes, stipulating that there was an outer world which we could measure and an inner world that we couldn't measure. So what he did at that point was creating a duality. It's called the Descartesian duality. So we have lived with that duality in the Western world now for 300 years, and maybe it has come to an end. I don't know. What do you say, Jens?
Yeah, I heard the new paradigm quite often being mentioned in the sessions that we already had today, in the conversations that we have. I mean, we both work for a company that works for the shift from being best in the world to be best for the world. We talk also a lot about the new paradigm, and I think that is essentially for me what this new paradigm is about. The inner experiences, and how the inner experiences also shape our experience of the, well, for lack of better word, outer world, and how we in that can also create the future by making intentional decisions.
Yeah, I agree on that. That is an interesting. I'm just coming back to Descartes and this dualism, which was more or less created as he was thinking of what is reality, and he wanted to get rid of everything that he couldn't hold for truth, and he didn't want to have any uncertainty. So the only thing he could be really certain of was himself being conscious about his consciousness, or whatever we can call it. So that was when he said the famous "I think, therefore I am," and by doing that he created this dualism. And at that point I would say it was probably not an issue at all, and definitely not for Descartes, I guess. But then later on we came to value what was called the outer world in this definition, and at the same time we didn't value the inner world, because of its not being efficient. Of course, you can't measure that because that's what the definition itself says. And it led us to where we are, of course, but we can always think of where could we have been. So let's think a little bit about what does this definition of inner and outer and measurable things, what does that lead to? What do you say, Jens? What is your experience of this?
I mean, I think we see, if we look at starting on a societal level, we can see that we are, like you said, very much driven by what we can measure, the objective things, the specific things that we can touch, see with our own eyes. And yeah, I mean, this has led us to, like you said, everything has a good and a bad side. But I think now we are experiencing also a shift, or like a tilt, like a tipping point, where we are seeing the results of being driven solely on these, let's call it for a moment, outer world objectives. And I think we right now see the collapse of our fragile systems, and most of the people have a sense, a feeling of like, this can't work forever, this is not the right way to go. But how do we express this feeling, how do I express this experience in a world that is so much focused on outer objectives?
And what I can really think of is it even possible to have something that is objective? That's an interesting thing in itself. But coming back to this definition of Descartes, the outer world is what we can measure, and the inner world is what we can't measure. It's a little bit odd, first of all, I would say, because if the outer world is stipulated by what we measure, then we can think of, okay, what do we then measure?
At the same time, I think we can, it's, you can always ask different questions. So, for example, can we measure emotions? Is that something we can, for the lack of a better word, objectify and put in a category? But if we talk, for example, about well-being, we can always ask, like, how do you feel? How do you feel from an how do you say this, experiential perspective? Do you have meaning in your life? So all these are ways of actually measuring well-being, personal well-being, emotional states. And so this is also something interesting to observe, that we are diving into the inner experiences, so to say, of people, and trying to measure those.
Yeah, and that seems that this definition of Descartes, he wanted to have something that it was very sharp. It was more or less either this or that. It shouldn't be intervening with each other, because the definition needed to be exact. And what you're talking about now is that maybe it's drifting. Can we measure thoughts? Can we measure feelings and so on? And that's one way to look at it. For me, as I've been studying maths for very long, I have objectives with this definition of Descartes. And the objectives I have is that, first of all, if the definition is the outer world is what we can measure, and the only thing we measure is the outer world, that makes the definition itself not valid. And it's not like it's drifting, as we were talking about. The result of what I just said is that it's not valid. It's like saying something as this is known, for instance, within the maths called sets. When you have a set of something, you can't define the set with the set itself. It's very, it's not valid mathematically, and maybe this is what have happened. We have used actually, if there is something called inner, then it's an inner subjective thought from Descartes, which is mistaken as being an outer objective truth. and which is quite funny when you start think of it, because um, then it's a mistake that we have been built the whole society upon. That's really crazy, actually. And for me, it's also, if this of course it made sense at the point, for 300 years ago. It was very crucial to make this distinction, because they wanted to leave the dark period, which was called the medieval times. For instance, that's something we have put on the medieval times after the medieval times. It's not like they defined themselves as being medieval, I guess. So they wanted to leave the myths and everything that was not certain. And it resulted in this Cartesian dualism, which we take as a truth. What you can't measure doesn't exist. The whole scientific worldview is more or less based upon it.
Yeah, and it's like, I have always the image in my mind based on these beliefs is like everything that is outside of my skin is the outer world, and everything that my skin is basically the separation to my inner world. But as you say, these are based on actually incongruent ways of defining outer and inner world. So what would really happen if you take away this I don't know, I don't want to say the barrier, but how can we look at it maybe from a holistic perspective where both parts are really one?
By saying inner and outer, it also stipulates that there is a spatial difference between me and the rest of the world. So I'm actually not a part of the world, more or less, when I separate myself from it. And that could be one of the reasons to why we have those so-called environmental issues or environmental crisis, or whatever we call it, because in the separation, the environment is something separate from me or from us as humanity, and the planet has to be saved. But as long as we keep this separation, we're not part of the environment, which is quite odd, because there has to be someone experiencing an environment to even make sense of the word environment. It has to be like someone experiencing the environment and then also being part of it, of course.
Yeah, it's a very simple maybe example that I have is like when I see people on the street smoking and throwing their cigarette ends onto the street or into the land, nature side. I always feel like so much, how can I say, like I feel like as if I am hurt myself, because I don't see myself connected from nature, and so I'm always wondering, how can you do this? Because in that moment you're basically hurting yourself, because you're hurting the environment, but as you are part of the environment, you're also hurting yourself.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And earlier today, we had in this studio another setup here, where it was called the Yellow Shares of Thinga. And in that session, or in that program, the host, Janet Andersson, and her guest, called Emma, they were sitting and putting their feet into the soil, and at some point there were questions in the soil. I don't know who had put them there, but it was interesting. And it was the Earth, Mother Earth herself, talking to Janet and Emma. And one of the questions was, "Why are you polluting me? Why are you polluting me?" And the thing is that when you say that, it means I.
Exactly. I'm actually hurting myself, and which probably leads to the assumption that I'm not whole, that I have some unresolved issues, that otherwise why would I hurt myself? And I think what we also touched upon is this separation not only from me to my environment, but also basically in that objectifying the environment, objectifying everything around me, it basically robs every entity a consciousness in itself. So we don't perceive, I don't know, a chair as something that has a consciousness, because it is an object that is basically not living.
Mm. Yeah, and what you're talking about here is something interesting, and that is consciousness. And we don't know much about it, actually, even if it's the thing we need every day to maneuver and to create stuff. And there is actually no good explanation to what consciousness really is, and it has been something that thinkers and philosophers and futurists and physicists and cosmologists have been talking about for very, very long. So, but there are some interesting things here that we could say about consciousness, and that is, as long as we are separating the inner from the outer, it's actually in opposition. We have the physical world in opposition to the mental or the consciousness and the mental pole, or whatever we call it. And that means that you can't have one with and at the same time have the other, which is odd. And from a scientific, I'm a scientist myself from start, from that worldview or the intellectual paradigm, we actually didn't focus much at all on the conscious level or the pole, and that's interesting in itself, because it's more or less the predominant thought in the intellectual paradigm is materialism, which says it's that what you see is what exists, and it's an objective outer world again. That is what is existing, and I'm just perceiving it as a representation of this outer objective world, measurable, of course.
Yeah, and it is like you said, you can't have both in that definition, because on the one hand you have the metaphysical, and on the other hand you have the physical. But if you choose to even find a space in between, you're at the same time saying, I'm not fully doing one, but I'm also not doing the other. So it's like you're basically trying to come up with a definition that doesn't make sense on both sides.
Let's draw something. We have an empty chart here, and I can draw something, and we can try to make sense of that. The first thing I would like then to draw is a linear model. We can call it the inner and outer world, and the two poles, the physical and the mental pole, and some states on that trip from A to B, or whatever you call it. So maybe you can comment a little bit while I'm drawing on the board. Let's see if I can draw this line from mental to physical, and see how it how it sums up.
I would like to touch upon an additional point while you're drawing this, and this is something you just mentioned before. Is there's also this notion in especially the scientific world that I am, as an observer, are the objective observer. So I'm not having any, how can I say it, like influence in how I'm looking at the world. And that's the scientific, I guess, belief, is to find an measurable objective truth that is unquestionable. That is also why I really much like that we are currently seeing more and more discussions about being biased, but that we all have our own biases, that we always speak from our own interpretation and perspective. So in that sense, it kind of reduces the objective observer
Yeah,
perspective.
definitely make them as a victim, more or less, for circumstances you can't really create, or you can't change anything from that story. Okay, so what I draw here was a mental pole to left and a physical pole to the right. It's a linear model, and there are some levels here. First of all, we have the belief level. It's quite close to mental, right? Hmm?
Yeah, so the beliefs are basically something that is totally metaphysical.
Yeah, I would say metaphysical and close to the mental pole, I guess. The closer we come to the mental pole, the harder it is to change the mental part of it. So that's the interesting thing in this linear model. Next part, we can call them thoughts. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
That's in between the mental and the physical pole. And then we have behavior. That's interesting, right?
Yes, that's almost physical.
So if those three blocks there represent Jens, I'm going to use the red pen here to see what is happening here. And the beliefs, they form our thoughts, right? So that's something we can agree upon, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the thoughts, they create our behavior. And if this was Jens, I'm drawing myself beneath and see how we interact them. So I wrote actions over there. We interact in the actions in the physical world.
Mm-hmm.
That's as close to the physical pole you can get, almost. And then, of course, it goes the other way around. Then the behavior forms your thoughts, right?
Yeah, I basically have an interpretation of my behavior. I form a thought, and based upon that, I form beliefs.
Yeah, that's right. So I add the arrow in the other direction.
And I guess that's the classical belief, how can you say, oscillation between mental and physical pole that we seem to always be going back and forth.
Yeah, this is the dominant worldview in the Western world on how we interact with people and how we take an inner experience and an outer objective truth to connect them with this very linear model. A lot of people, I guess, they have had experiences that don't fit into this model. That was actually the case in my life. I had a 2-year period where I had experiences that were the biggest experience in my life, actually. My first daughter was being born. A year later, 14 months later, she died. And then another year later, my son was born. So in this 2-year period, I had a lot of, what can we call it? There was a lot of friction. And at the same time, I chose the huge amount of openness. And when you combine openness with friction, you get a much learning, I guess. And the interesting thing here was that the biggest experiences I had in my life couldn't explain what I couldn't be explained within the worldview I was taught. And I had actually studied this quite a lot. I mentioned before I'm studying a lot of maths and physics and economics and so on. So I was in the academia for many years, and got some grades there and everything, and some you know them, the curriculum, and it actually didn't only tell me. It wasn't like, okay, Stellan, you have experienced something. It's a white spot on the map. Go there and report home. It was more or less, this isn't true. And then I was faced with two options. Either what I've been taught, we can call it the map, the worldview I've been taught, or the experiences I had, which I couldn't say. I mean, they were as real as they could ever be. And then I realized that, okay, I must choose. I must choose either the worldview or my experiences that I couldn't hold, but anything as being real, the reality as I experienced this. And that meant that this model here wasn't fit.
Can you give us an example of what exactly the
Yeah.
friction was? I mean, I
The
understand.
friction, yeah, okay. So the friction was, of course, how can I say it? First of all, when you become a parent, I would say, for me at least, that was the one of the biggest gifts I've ever been given. And it was also one of the biggest tasks I ever been given. From a leadership issue, for instance, it's like the biggest leadership issue you probably will face, and it's a lifelong obligation, even if life gets very short. And short is interesting because that's in an interpretation of a chronological time. But one thing is that my daughter, she's called Isa, she lived her whole life. She really lived, and she was really alive. So I would say that the friction itself was actually between what I experienced and what I was taught, the system that I have been raised in, the worldview I was trained in.
So your beliefs or the two poles didn't really come together for you anymore.
The two poles weren't really two poles. That was the interesting thing. So, for instance, today I can't say how. I'm the interesting thing here is that I was trained in drawing maps. We can call it like that. Drawing maps, putting things together and make sense out of it. So the interesting thing with those maps was that the ones that I had been taught didn't work out well. They couldn't explain the experiences I had. For instance, I'm totally certain on my own truth is it doesn't start because of that you're born, and it doesn't end because that you physically die. And that is something I hadn't thought of before those events, and it didn't fit into to this model, I say. And so I needed another world view. And the interesting thing, before we leave this linear model, if we take Descartes' dualistic worldview and put that into this linear model, where do you say that the inner and outer world are separated? We talked about it a little bit earlier, of course, but
I mean, there's definitely a separation in the interaction, in the actions between two people,
but what I'm looking for is in the model, the horizontal linear model. There is like what is measurable. We can start with what is measurable.
Yeah, I would say starting from what is most measurable in the common definition would be behavior, and then the thoughts yeah, we can talk about it, but can we really measure it? So this is where I would draw the line. Exactly, this is where we see the separation.
And that is interesting because, as you mentioned before, now we maybe can measure thoughts. Is it then just a matter of time until we can measure beliefs? Well, that's an interesting question. Okay, so in this setup, in this liner model, we have an inner and an outer world, and it's separated by this green line then. And well, is this is this a true model? That's interesting. A model is just a representation of something. It's something that we need to easily talk about something. And in this case, it's also the design criteria for the whole Western world. And if we only value what is here called the outer world, the behaviors and the actions, then we miss the inner world. We don't value that because it's not efficient.
I'm thinking of like models that would explain, for example, in evolution and beliefs, which is, for example, spiral dynamics, Ken Wilber's work, developmentalism. There are a lot of models out there that try to explain these evolutions and in beliefs and thought systems. However, putting ourselves into a very physical world, they are looked at very critically to put it in a nice way.
Yeah, that's right. I'm also very interested in those models that you are talking about. So maybe we can explore them in this program series during this weekend. And before we should stay a little bit longer in this liner model, because there are things happening in this model. Of course, it's interesting to talk about the physical pole and the resistance in the physical pole. We call it reality. But why is something more real than something else? Can you even say a real more real, the real? Yes, I don't even know if it's like possible. So can we even talk about an inner reality and an outer reality? That's an interesting question here. And also this definition itself, as we mentioned before, it's a circle definition in my terms that I use, because it says that the outer world is what we measure, and the only thing we measure is the outer world. So we're stepping around in the same. It's a non-valid definition.
So basically, what you're saying is, in order to measure the outer world, we have created tools and measurements in the outer world to measure again the outer world, and that's a loop definition.
Yeah, it's a loop definition, or a circle or loop definition. I don't know what it's called. And that's the one thing. And the other interesting thing here is that it also makes the so-called inner world or inner reality non-valid or not useful, or and you can see this in many parts of society. For instance, we have in the universities we have behavioral science. There is no fantasy science, and we very often talk about the senses, but those are only the outer senses. For instance, the taste, the feeling, touching, and
listening.
Yeah, that's right. All of those are outer senses. We have also inner. I mean, dreaming is one, and perception is another. Memory, feelings. A lot of senses that we have inside in this model that we don't value because we can't measure them. So in being eager to measure, we forget what is maybe most important here.
I'm just reminded of the program that we just had before, where they talked about sustainable change can only come from if you are connected on an emotional level, and if you have an emotional drive to change your behavior. So in my interpretation, there is something that is on the inner world driving the behavior on the outer world. And in really to anchor the change in the outer world, you have to anchor it in the inner world. So there is already a dynamic observable that we now speak of in order to make really sustainable change. So it's not only behavioral change is enough. I always say like it's going on holidays. It's like you can for a while you try different habits, you do have a different lifestyle, and maybe you really like it, but then you after 2 weeks you come home, and what happens? You switch back immediately to the old habits, to the old behaviors that you had before. Why? Because you haven't integrated a new belief system. Or you believe it was just for the 2 weeks vacation that I can be myself now, or recharge, or whatever it is.
Yeah, that's right. I want to draw another definition, if it's okay, because draw this green line here separating the inner and outer world as Descartes defined them. I have a suggestion for another definition of inner and outer. If we should even use those terms, it could be of interest to have something that is not separating us, maybe. So I'm going to try this out. This is an idea I had approximately two years ago, I guess it was, and I presented it the first time at something called the World Values Initiative Day, called World Values Day. I was keynote speaker there, and I tried to see the response of it, and so let's publish it to the world and see if anyone here likes this idea. And before we do that, I would say this is not truths. This is ideas, of course, but there are some interesting ideas within this what we're going to show now that I guess is very useful. So hang on.
Yeah, and as you said before, with friction, which is normally caused by bringing up new ideas, and having an open mind, and maybe also an open body, an open emotional system, see how this responds. How do you respond to that? And then you put it nicely. The friction and the openness leads to a lot of learning. So maybe we learned something new today. I'm quite excited actually to see what you're coming up with, and to find a way of how your experiences can be seen from a holistic perspective.
And the experiences I had were very huge and also interesting, of course, and one of them was very fundamental for me. It was late one night in a telephone call with a woman on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, and I had insight that night in that telephone call, which was the biggest insights in my life. And it was not. There are so many ways to look at an insight. It could be a aha experience, or a haha experience, or a wow experience. But this experience was like, whoom, directly into my solar plexus. I got struck by this insight. I got very angry. I really I took my fist in my pocket, and I was really like so mad that no one had told me this in my childhood or in school or anything. And the insight was about the future, because I had been told up until that day that the future was something I should be prepared to face. And at that very moment, I realized that the future is something I create. And that is actually, it's a totally different worldview. Maybe you don't believe that when I just say it like that, but yeah, we're going to explore this, I guess, this weekend together in this series, the FiDE series. So let's get back to to the board for a while, and what I wrote there was the inner world. Could it be interesting to call the inner world the dynamic world?
Yeah.
And
Let's start with this.
congruent with that, or the other part would then be the outer world is the static world. Could that be of interest? So if something is dynamic, I mean possibilities and stuff like that, and then static is what is. Okay. Can it be both static and dynamic at the same time? No. Or either it's still or it's moving, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So if we use that definition, that in itself should be a very clear definition. Either or.
Mhm.
Okay. So it can't be both. Inner and outer. Okay. Something like that. Either it's dynamic or it's static. Then it could be more dynamic, of course, and even more dynamic, and extremely much dynamic. But when it's static, it's static. It's still. It doesn't move at all. Okay. Dead, maybe we can call it. I don't know. Okay, so does that definition make any sense?
It does to me, and then I'm just trying to think of an example. For example,
An example, for example.
yeah, and what I'm thinking of is innovation processes, which usually start with, well, let's call it a framing, to avoid the problem definition, but a clear understanding of what is the situation that we're talking about, and then you do a brainstorming session where you bring in a lot of ideas, a lot of dynamic ways of looking at how can we deal with this situation. Some don't make sense at all, or maybe they do, I don't know, maybe it's part of the process. But anyway, there are, what I'm trying to say, you create a lot of possible ways of approaching the situation. And then over time, you're narrowing it down through different principles, through different reflection processes, and you basically come to, I would say, condensed version of where you have a specific outcome out of all the potential and infinitive opportunities that you had explored before.
Yeah, I do agree on that elaboration you just did. So if we then look at this liner model for a while again, where is this in the liner model, the separation between the inner and outer world with this new definition? Where can we put that?
Wouldn't it be the same?
Let's try. Can we have behavior that is dynamic or static, first of all?
When you phrase it like this, it can be actually both.
Okay, interesting. Okay, next, thoughts. Can they be dynamic or static?
I guess that's the example I just made.
Yeah. And then beliefs. Can we have static beliefs, and can we choose new ones?
I think that's what all the great philosophers are trying us to tell, is like, look at the belief system and entertain a belief system, but don't take it as the truth and take it for granted.
Okay, so I put it up again. So what we actually have experienced here together is that if we use this new type of or this new definition of the inner and outer world, again saying that the inner world is a dynamic world and the outer world is a static world. It actually tells us that instead of dividing us and separating us, even if in this is the interesting thing, because this means that we can actually bridge this linear model to something non-linear. So I'm just redrawing a new green line just so that everyone sees where it is.
Yeah, and what I'm thinking of now that you have said this is that we can display so many different behaviors, but it is always, I guess, context dependent on which behavior then we specifically choose to display. And in that way, the explanation you just gave makes sense for me, because there are different options that we can choose in any situation, but what we do is that we in the end choose probably one specific one.
Mm. So I guess this is enough for this first session we have on elaborating on FiDE's thoughts. And what we have here is, again, something that is telling us maybe that there are other ways to look at the world, or the complex system we call life, or the complex system we call an organization. And when we look at this, it's actually telling us that as long as we separate the physical and the mental pole into a linear, in a linear model, we will have them in opposition to each other. But we just realize that there are other ways to define an inner and outer world. If we need that, of course, that's a question in itself, if we need that kind of a language. But if we're going to use such a language, maybe this is a better way to put it, because it doesn't say that only what is measurable is interesting. This says that the outer world is the static world and the inner world is the dynamic world, and that is something else than measuring. So
I would be interested in what you as a listener, what you as the audience are thinking of this. How do you respond to that? What are your thoughts, feelings, emotions, any kind of reactions, reflections on this? Let us know. You can comment in the YouTube channel under the video. Yeah, just share and engage with the material.
Yeah, and it would be very interesting to as you said, hear what people say about this these ideas. And when we're not setting them in opposition to the existing, or we can almost call it, or maybe we can call it, the old paradigm. But what we are saying is that it's time for another way of looking at the world, which is not linear, which is not separating, which is more congruent to us as persons and as organizations and societies, and what is also more alive and conscious. That is probably what this series we will have. I don't know how many programs we have during this weekend, but we will elaborate on different models. We will hopefully dig into the tree model next time we talk, you and I, and the tree metaphor, which is a fantastic metaphor for, which is non-linear. A tree is not a linear model. So anything else you want to add before we say thanks for now, and we'll be back and stuff like that?
Well, I think you gave a good outlook. I'm thinking of that things are evolving, that we have had already different programs that spoke about the evolution of belief systems. And when I'm looking at the linear model that we have seen here, is in some way we started out from a physical pole and then went to the mental pole. But this is kind of, it seems like this is where we are stuck in right now, between swinging back and forth between those poles. but every time we do it, we maybe expand also into a more complex understanding of how this, how can I say it, of how distant or how, of what complexity the connection between those poles, if they are two poles, are made of. So this is quite interesting to see, and we're going to explore this a little bit further.
Yeah, definitely, and I suggest the next program we talk about the tree metaphor and what that can bring us in understanding other ways of looking at the world. So, but I say let's keep it for now, and let's call it a good talk here together. It's been super interesting, Jens, to have you here together with me in this FiDE dialogue, or maybe it's you having me in the, or maybe it's us. That's interesting. We didn't know yet. So thank you also everyone for listening. I would say that this whole weekend is brought to you by Engage People. And if you want to co-create, you can go to www.bestforthe.world, and there are instructions there. So coming into contact with us, and you can be both a guest in a program, and you can host a program, and there is still some spots. And you can also support us on Patreon. So go to patreon.com, find Best for the World, and every contribution is important right now. So and we thank also for those who have already supported us on Patreon, and we're so glad for that. And hope to see you soon again, both in the YouTube channel and on the web radio bestforthe.world. Thank you very much, and we keep in touch.
We are creating the world we're now living in. We are competing in. We are repeating in. We are believing in. It's time for us to shift our mind from best in the world to best for the world. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional. It creates a new world to mind a shift. Intentionality, perceptuality, conceptuality. We are choosing to shift our mind to best for the world, best for our world. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional.